many hobbies do you have? If you have ADHD, it's probably innumerable. In other words, we have a lot of hobbies. Hi, and welcome to my channel, Janine Van Stee, ADHD Life Coach. That's me. I'm Janine Van Stee. And if you're new here, hit that subscribe button. We have a lot of fun and cool stuff here for you. And hit that like button. It always helps the channel, and I love to provide information for people about ADHD. So what's the deal with ADHD and hobbies? Seems like we have a ton of them, but they don't last very long a lot of times. If you have ADHD and you look back on your life and you can find one or two hobbies that you've carried throughout your life, it's pretty unusual. The only hobby that I've managed to hold on to is drinking coffee. Other than that, everything comes and goes so quickly that sometimes I don't even know what my hobbies are. The list of hobbies that I have is exhausting. Between crafts and sewing and drawing and art and physical activities like kayaking or walking or swimming or any of those things, I've got them all. And in typical ADHD manner, I have researched each one of them to the fullest extent and tried to master each one. Very few have I ever really mastered, though, because I lose interest, which happens a lot with people with ADHD. It's hard to sustain interest in something for a length of time. I mean, did you know that there are 7 species of giraffe and that each one has their own pattern of blotches on their body, and they live in different regions in Africa, and that some of the species are actually endangered, but because they're counted as one big species and not individualized, they're not? I know all of that because I fell in love with a giraffe at a zoo. And giraffes became my hobby for a while. And I learned a lot about giraffes. I still love giraffes. But I don't really research them very much anymore. And I don't love them the way that I used to because I know so much about them now that they're not as interesting, novel, urgent, or challenging. So when I find a new hobby, I find something that interests me. It sparks my interest. I say, hey, that's cool. I don't know about any of you, but when I walk through a craft show or something like that, I'm like, I could make that. I could do that. Then I decide I'm going to. Oh, yeah, I can do this. And then I decide, I'm going to buy all of the stuff. I'm going to do it. I'm going to make these things. I go in and I learn how to do it, and I make one, maybe two. And these were going to be Christmas gifts for people. And I've lost interest because yes, I can do it. I figured out how, and they're cute, and now they're boring. So I move on to something else. Now, not all of my hobbies disappear completely. They go into the hobby abyss, which I'm sure a lot of you guys have a hobby abyss. It's usually a room or a corner or some drawers or some chests or something that's full of hobby supplies. Those are the hobby supplies that sometimes we come back to. So we don't always give up our hobbies. We come back to them sometimes too. And while sometimes this feels a little comical and a little funny because it is, we're ridiculous with our hobbies, but it's okay. It's not okay in a lot of ways. One of those ways is we end up spending a lot of money on things that we aren't going to use, aren't going to do. I call it the ADHD tax because we spend a lot of extra money just trying to figure out how to stay interested, challenged, have some urgency, all those things. So we end up spending a little bit more money on our hobbies. And another thing is we oftentimes experience a lot of guilt surrounding this. Because first of all, we've spent a bunch of money on a hobby that now we are giving up or we aren't as interested in anymore. And then the guilt sets in. Not only the guilt over the money, but the guilt over the inability to maintain your attention long enough to stick with a hobby, and you start to feel insufficient and less than. Let's talk about that. When we find a new hobby, It's exciting. We get the dopamine dump when we're doing this. I'll use this as an example. So I have been drawing like crazy lately. I mean, like for the last 3 months, and I hadn't drawn for 10 years. And all of a sudden I picked up my pad and my pencil, and next thing you know, I'm like full blown into drawing. I was drawing every single day. I was drawing for hours a day and really dove into that hobby. It was an old hobby that I found again and approached in a different way, and so it re-sparked my interest. I'm still drawing, but not with the enthusiasm and excitement that I was drawing with a month ago. I'm hoping to hold on to this hobby, but I have to be okay with letting it go if that's what my brain says I need to do. So the process of having a hobby is really what the hobby is about. If you enjoy what you're doing when you're working on the hobby and you never get to a finished product, or it's never perfect, or it's never mastered. As ADHDers, we're constantly seeking that dopamine. So it makes sense that when the dopamine stops coming at such a high rate with a hobby, that we would lose interest in it because we're not getting the same dopamine from it that we got at first. Does that negate the dopamine that we got? The point I'm trying to make is it the process of the hobby that gives us the dopamine, or is it the finished product? I can tell you that 9 times out of 10, it's usually the process that we're enjoying. We're enjoying the research, we're enjoying the newness of it, the trying to figure it out, the puzzle, so to say. And it's fun and it's interesting, and we are getting the dopamine. And we are benefiting from all of the additional knowledge that we are building because we have tons of knowledge about hobbies that we have, started and have used. Is all of that negated if you stop doing that hobby? I'm interested to see what you guys might say about that, because is a hobby about a finished product, or is a hobby about the process? I argue it's about the process. And we need to let go of the guilt of enjoying the process when we do, and being able to let go of it and say, yeah, that was great. I'm so glad I did that hobby for a while. It's kind of like going on vacation, right? It ends. And by the time it's over, a lot of times we're like ready to go home. Kind of the same thing. Doesn't mean you'd never go back though, right? You might like to go back, but you've had enough for now. Same thing with a hobby. So how do we wrap our minds around the guilt that's associated with dropping a hobby that you've been hot on like for a minute? You've bored your family and your friends with it. You've spent money. You've spent time. How do you let go of that guilt? So let's look at the definition of hobby. A hobby is an activity done regularly in one's leisure time for pleasure. So here's the question. When you lose interest in your hobby and it ceases to be pleasurable, is it even still a hobby? Maybe not right now. Maybe, again, some other time. But right now, it ceases to be a hobby when it ceases to bring you pleasure. Is it okay to put that away and maybe get it out some other time, or maybe never come back to it? Did you get the enjoyment and the enrichment out of the experience? You've been successful with your hobby. I had a great conversation with my future son-in-law the other day on my podcast about just this. And he was talking about having tremendous guilt when he would lose interest in a hobby and stop doing it, and how coaching had helped him through that. But one of the things that we talked about was seasons and hobbies, because some hobbies are very seasonal. I mean, I can't kayak in the dead of winter, so that's going to be a summer activity and it's going to be a summer hobby. So I won't feel guilt when come fall and the temperature drops to 50 degrees, I'm not out on my kayak. If I'm drawing though, I can draw any time of the year. But if I make it a seasonal activity, then I can end it at the end of that season and start it up in a different season and be okay with it, because it's just my timeline. So like I could say quilting is a fall and winter hobby for me. And in the spring, it's okay for me to walk away from the sewing machine and not come back to it until the fall. And I just thought that was a really interesting way to look at things, is looking at your hobbies as seasonal, because you come back to a lot of them in different seasons of your life or different seasons of weather, right? So just an interesting take. Maybe make some of your hobbies seasonal so that they don't wear out. I personally have embraced my hobby hoarding. I have such a plethora, love that word, plethora, of different knowledge and information about a lot of different hobbies that I've had, and I keep that forever. So the process of the hobby, all the things that I learned during the hobby, all the dopamine that I get dumped during the hobby, all of those things are great. I don't have to hold on to a hobby because society says we don't quit. Hobbies are for us. They're for our pleasure, they're for our enjoyment, and they're what we choose to do. If your brain doesn't want to do it anymore, it's not a hobby anymore, and then it just becomes work. So that's my take on hobby hoarding and giving up that guilt that's associated with losing interest in our hobbies. That's part of how our brains work. There's nothing to be guilty about. Hobbies are for us, not for other people. So remember, enjoy the process, enjoy the dopamine dump, and when it stops doing what you want it to do for you, it's okay to give it up for a while or forever. I hope you've enjoyed the content today and my little talk on hobbies. If you did, don't forget to hit the like button and the subscribe button. It helps a lot, and we'll see you next time.